Hello, thank you everyone for coming. I just want to remind everyone at the start of the program that there's no photography or video recording during this event. Thank you everyone so much for coming. My name is Sean Keaty. I'm the chair of the Georgetown University Lecture Fund, and we can't thank you enough for coming to our 2012 Michael Jurist Memorial Lecture. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to say for a moment the reason we organized this lecture in the first place. Michael Jurist was a former Georgetown student and a former chair of the Lecture Fund, who unfortunately passed away shortly after his senior year of college here at Georgetown in 2007. He was a gregarious, intelligent, and talented individual, and it's the honor of the Lecture Fund to put on this event every year in his memory, and we're extremely grateful to have his family here with us to help bring his legacy to a new generation of Georgetown students. So thank you for coming. Our first speaker is a noted broadcaster, New York Times bestselling author, advocate, publisher, and philanthropist Tavis Smiley. Mr. Smiley is the host of the late-night talk show, Tavis Smiley on PBS, the Tavis Smiley Talk Show, and the co-host of Smiley and West, distributed by Public Radio International. Educator and philosopher Cornel West is the class of 1943 university professor at Princeton University. Known as one of America's most gifted, provocative, and most important democratic intellectuals, Dr. West is also the co-host of Smiley and West and author of several New York Times bestsellers. Dr. West has made the subject of poverty a hallmark of his career, and together with Mr. Smiley, they've co-written their first book, The Rich and the Rest of Us, a Poverty Manifesto, which is available for purchase and signing following this event. So without further ado, on behalf of the Georgetown University Lecture Fund, the Kamenowitz Initiative, the Office of Diversity and Affirmative Action, and the College Democrats, please join me in welcoming Dr. West and Mr. Tavis Smiley. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Sean. That was a very, very kind introduction. That may very well be, Doc, the second nicest introduction we've ever received. And I only say second nicest because we were somewhere the other night, and the person to introduce us didn't show up, and we did it ourselves. But other than that, it was awfully nice, Sean, and I thank you. Let me just say how honored we are to be on this wonderful campus of Georgetown. I've been here a number of times before over the years, but it's been quite a while since I've been here, so I'm delighted to be back on your campus, and could not be more humbled to be here tonight to talk about the issue of poverty and to engage all of you in a conversation about this issue in just a moment. Let me say at the outset that Dr. West and I believe that poverty is the moral and spiritual issue of our time. We believe, once again, it is the moral and spiritual issue of our time, and that's what you are going to read in this new text, The Rich and the Rest of Us, a Poverty Manifesto. Let me just give a quick rundown of how we want to do this tonight and make the best use of our time. You may have heard that Dr. West and I are doing a live program tonight with Piers Morgan on CNN immediately following this from this very room. So we have to be on time tonight because we have a live hit right at 9 o'clock around the country, around the world for that matter. So I'm going to speak for a few minutes, pass the mic to Dr. West to speak for a few minutes, and then we want to give the microphones and the audience to you to engage in some discourse. And then we're going to sit and sign your books, and then we're going to get mic'd up and go live on CNN at 9 o'clock. So we have an ambitious agenda over the next couple hours, but we're delighted that so many of you are here tonight for this conversation. Before I go further with my initial comments before yielding to Professor West, to the Jurist family who we had a chance to meet earlier, we are delighted that this lecture, our lecture, is in collaboration with you and in memory of your son, and we thank you for your support of his ongoing legacy on this particular campus. So please thank the Jurist once again for making our appearance here. Thank you very much. Yes. We want to thank them for making our appearance here on the campus possible this evening. Let me just offer a few thoughts about this book and why this book and why now for this text, and then I'll let Dr. West share in his own way. I said a moment ago that we believe that poverty is the moral and spiritual issue of our time. We believe that, and we've written this book in part because we are of the mind that poverty in this country as structured currently, is a threat to our democracy. Poverty threatens our democracy as we know it. For some, that might sound hyperbolic, that might sound a bit over the top, but it is not. No democracy can sustain itself when half of its people are wrestling with poverty. The numbers that we now know from our Census Bureau are simply these. 1 out of 2 Americans is either in or near poverty. Put another way, if you take the perennially poor in this country, or the persistent poor, put on top of that the new poor, and we argue in this new text that the new poor are the former middle class. In every presidential election season like the one we're in now, Mr. Romney, the presumptive nominee for his party, and Mr. Obama, the nominee for his party, and whoever else might get in this race, God knows. But whoever these nominees are, they're going to be talking, as they always do, to the middle class. They want to address the angst of the middle class. Well, if the middle class now make up the new poor, who are you going to talk to? So that strategy, that game, that well-worn theme of running for high office and speaking to the angst of the middle class isn't going to work so well this time because, again, the new poor are the former middle class. So you have the perennially poor, you have the new poor, and you have the near poor, folk who are just a paycheck away from being in poverty. When you combine the perennially poor, the new poor, and the near poor, you're talking about 150 million Americans. 150 million Americans. I was no math major, but I think that means that 1 out of every 2 of us in this nation is wrestling with poverty. Tell me how then one can sustain a democracy when the gap between the have-gots and the have-nots is that wide and continues to widen. And that is why the Occupy movement has taken such hold in this country with that notion of the 99 versus the 1, because the gap, the income inequality in this country is so wide and growing so exponentially. Dr. West and I have discussed these issues and talked about these issues for years in our individual and our collective work. We are honored every week, every day, to be heard around the country on a radio program, a public radio program called Smiley and West. So in addition to my PBS program every night, my own radio show, I created a program a couple of years ago and called Smiley and West. And I did that because I regard Dr. West as our country's leading public intellectual. That's my sense of him, that he's our nation's leading public intellectual, and I wanted him to have a platform where people could be exposed to, could hear from his wisdom and his wit and his expertise and his view of the world on a variety of topics. And I couldn't be more delighted with the last almost 2 years now, how well this public radio program is working. But we've both discussed this issue and done work on the issue of poverty throughout our various careers and lives. But through the platform of this public radio program, we've taken on this issue much more seriously and much more, I shouldn't say more seriously, much more aggressively is the right word. We've always been serious about it, but much more aggressively. And so last summer, we got on a bus and engaged what we call the Poverty Tour. We went to 11 states. We gave up part of our summer, went to 11 states, went to 18 cities to see what the Great Recession, so-called, had done to the majority of Americans, or half of the country at least. What has the Great Recession done to the nation? And without going into all that you're going to read in the book, when you pick up a copy, you'll see that we discovered that Americans of all races, of all colors, of all creeds are wrestling with poverty. So often when we talk about poverty, we tend to think of poverty as something that is color-coded. So you think poverty, you think black. You think poverty, you think brown. That, in fact, is not the case. I know that some might find it laughable that we are on a campus that is as prestigious as Georgetown, a campus that costs as much to attend as you are paying. And I know you know how much it costs because, well, your mama and them do at least, know how much it costs for you to go here. So some might find it ludicrous or laughable that we be talking about poverty at a place like Georgetown. Well, not so, because we saw on this tour last summer that, again, Americans of all races, of all colors, of all creeds are wrestling with this issue of poverty. I was watching 60 Minutes just a few weeks ago, and they had a wonderful show that Scott Pelley, I think, was the host of this particular segment, a segment about poverty in America. And the panel was a panel of a dozen Americans, mostly white Americans, some color on the panel, but mostly white Americans. I'm glad 60 Minutes did this. Mostly white Americans on this panel who were all at one point solidly in the middle class. They all had six-figure jobs. They at one point had homes. They at one point had 401ks. They at one point had savings. They had all the trappings that we expect one to have who has realized the American dream. And then they lost it all, courtesy of being laid off, being pink-slipped, being downsized. Some had medical challenges, but a variety of things happened to these Americans of all races, colors, and creeds, and both genders, and the bottom fell out. And I was fascinated to watch this conversation, knowing that we were putting the finishing touches on our book and about to come out on the road for this book tour. And I watched those Americans talk about their experience. And almost to a person, they had gotten beyond the anger of losing their home. And if not beyond it, they had properly contextualized the fact that, okay, I've lost my home, I've lost my job, I've lost my home, I've lost my 401k, I've spent all my savings. Okay, that it is what it is. They'd been unemployed for a year, 2, 3, 4 years. They were beyond the embarrassment in front of family and friends of being unemployed for so long. But the one thing that they were fighting to hold on to was their dignity. And you know why. Because there is dignity in work. There is dignity found in labor. And when you don't have an opportunity to use the gifts and the skills and the talents that you've been endowed with, it makes it hard to hold on to your own dignity. And then when poor people in this country end up being rendered invisible, that's the worst thing you can do to a poor person, make him or her feel invisible. But that's what's happening in America. We don't want to talk about poverty in America. I'll come back to that in just a second. The poor end up being rendered invisible. They end up being an afterthought, or at best, a political calculation in a presidential election year, if anything. And so you start to understand now how a country struggles with holding on to its democracy. You start to understand, as Doc and I argue in the book, that poverty is a matter of national security. That's how serious this issue is. So we can't continue to ignore the poor. We can't continue to ignore the issue of poverty, particularly when, again, if 1 out of 2 of us is wrestling with poverty, that means one you. That's how dire this is. So somebody to your left or somebody to your right is struggling to try to make it. We discovered on this tour that so many people are suffering in silence because you don't want to tell people with your Georgetown degree, with all your work experience, that you've been unemployed, that you can't find work for a year or 2 or 3. So many Americans are suffering in silence. The Pew study we cite in this book, there's a Pew study that came out that found that so many Americans who are in fact poor, by the technical definition, they are poor, they are unemployed, they've been unemployed for quite some time, but these persons who have been in the middle class tell the Pew Research in their study that they don't identify themselves as poor. You get this. Psychologically, they can't even their condition is one of poverty, but they psychologically can't bring themselves to say, I am poor. I get that. Existentially, I guess I get that. You don't want to psychologically give in to the fact that you have fallen into the ranks of the poor, because you think of the poor as those people. You think of the poor as those wrestling with those conditions. You don't want to intake that. You don't want to acknowledge that. I get that. But the reality on the ground is that we are a country where this gap is getting wider. We're a country that, as the gap widens, a country doesn't really want to talk about poverty. Let me take you back right quick before I get Dr. West up here. 4 years ago, we were in our last campaign for the White House. 3 presidential debates. I heard the phrase college Democrats uttered earlier here tonight. 3 presidential debates the last time around. The word poor or poverty doesn't come up one time. The economy was tanking at that moment. Obama and McCain were debating the economy and who was best equipped to deal with it. But in 3 presidential debates, Obama doesn't mention the word poor or poverty. McCain doesn't mention the word poor or poverty. The moderators in 3 presidential debates don't ask a single question. 3 90-minute debates seen around the world. The economy is tanking. Not a single question, no reference, no mention of the poor or poverty. Fast forward 4 years, and the numbers are, as I suggested, they are earlier. How then do we put our head in the sand and somehow think that ignoring this issue, this moral and spiritual issue paramount in our time, how do we think that we ignore that and somehow advance the cause of democracy, somehow advance the cause of freedom, somehow hold on to that notion of the American dream? We quote George Carlin, the late great comedian. Carlin had a great line. Some of y'all too young to remember this, but Carlin had a great line when he said that they call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe in it. And that rings true for so many Americans now. That notion of the American dream just doesn't even ring true the way it once did, because we see all around us people's lives being crushed, infrastructure crumbling. And on this tour, we met so many people of all stripes. We were in Akron, Ohio one day in a room full of military veterans. Something is really wrong with the country when the folk who put their lives on the line to protect our freedoms come back home with all that experience, all that know-how, all that sacrifice, all that struggle, all that service on our behalf, and they can't find unemployment. Something is wrong when military veterans have a more difficult time than the rest of us trying to find unemployment. That is not a grateful nation. Something is wrong with that. Something is wrong in a nation where women and children, these are the facts. Something is wrong in a nation where women and children are falling faster into poverty than any other group. Something is wrong with that. How does a nation let so often it's weak and vulnerable, fall into poverty fastest? Those are the facts. Women and children falling faster into poverty than anybody else in this country. And so politically, we find ourselves in a campaign for the White House, and Dr. West and I are determined if we have anything to say about it, we are not going to endure another race for the White House where poverty gets swept under the rug, where we don't have a national conversation about poverty. And so this book in chapter 1 lays out a portrait of poverty. How did we arrive at this place? And then we talk about the poverty of opportunity in America, and the poverty of affirmation in America, and the poverty of vision in America, and the poverty of courage and compassion in America, and the poverty of imagination in America. And then we lay out a chapter trying to debunk all the lies, the 10 worst lies that are told about poverty, the 10 worst lies that are regurgitated again and again about the poor. Then we close this text with a Poverty Manifesto, 12 things that we have to do right now. In many ways, this is our last best chance to wrap our arms around this issue. We saw what happened again in Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen. Folk can only take this for so long. I don't know if it's our hubris or our arrogance or our narcissism or our nationalism that doesn't allow us to even wrestle with this, but you history buffs know that there is no empire in the history of the world that at some point did not falter or fail. Every empire eventually goes down. It might come back up, but they go down. And for whatever reason, we don't even want to wrestle with the notion, the idea, the possibility that this great nation of ours could be on the precipice of something very dangerous. But Doc and I are not afraid to take that on, not afraid to talk about that, and to try to push the issue of poverty, push the issue of what we're doing to the poor higher up on the American agenda. Mr. Romney's wrong. This is not the politics of envy. Pardon my English. Ain't nobody mad at what you have. Ain't nobody envious or jealous of what you got. I just want to have an opportunity to get my own. That's all. I just want an opportunity to get my own. And so the time is now. The time is now for this conversation. Doc and I are not naive, number one. Number two, we're not the only ones out doing this. There are some long-distance runners in this country fighting against poverty. Marion Wright Edelman, right here in D.C., the Children's Defense Fund. Her husband, Peter Edelman. A lot of folk fighting against it. But we have to be diligent. We have to be vigilant right now, because if we don't, we end up repeating the mistakes of the past. Two things, and I'll give it to Dr. West. The last time we had a conversation in this country, a sustained conversation from the top of our government about the poor, was before you were born. the Johnson years. You know, you study this, the war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson administration. That's the last time we've had a real sustained conversation, top down, about reducing and eradicating poverty in this country. I was on Bill Maher last Friday night, and Bill asked me about this, and so we got into a conversation again. Speaking of Democrats, I love Bill Clinton. He's a personal friend. I was honored that when he was in the White House for those 8 years, he granted me more one-on-one sit-down interviews than anybody else in the media. For whatever reason, he and I have been getting along for all these years, and so he gave me a lot of interviews. The first interview he gave, 8 months, he did not talk for 8 months, as you can imagine why. For 8 months after that Lewinsky scandal, he didn't want to talk to nobody. But when he finally decided to talk, 8 months later, he called me to give me the first one-on-one. So we've been dear friends, and he's honored me by giving me the opportunity to interview him in the White House countless times, and we've traveled the world together to Africa and other places. So he's a friend. But one of the worst mistakes he made was when he signed that so-called welfare reform bill 15 years ago. And the New York Times, in a huge front-page expose just 2 weeks ago, unearthed and unpacked what this so-called welfare bill has done 15 years later to women and children, and they made the link that some of us predicted 15 years ago to why now women and children are falling faster into poverty than anybody else. So even when we have friends in the White House, you got to push them. Great presidents are not born, great presidents are made. They have to be pushed into their greatness. There is no FDR without A. Philip Randolph pushing him. Back farther, there is no Abraham Lincoln without Frederick Douglass pushing him. There is no LBJ without MLK pushing him. And if we don't push Barack Obama or whoever is to come, then this country will never, ever come to true terms with the least among us. And so the time is now for a real conversation about a national plan to reduce and eradicate poverty. It is possible, it is sustainable, and we are here to talk about it tonight. Please welcome Princeton professor, Dr. Cornel West.
Let me say that I am deeply blessed and honored to be here at Georgetown. In fact, return to Georgetown. I've been blessed to be here a number of times, but to be part of this lecture series, I want to thank the new president and leader, Brother Sean. Give him a hand. Give Brother Sean a hand here. Brother Sean in the house, And in the memory of our dear brother, Michael Jurist, grand life, critical intelligence, creative imagination, deep love, compassion, represented the best of what Georgetown was all about. And to have Brother Paul and Sister Vesna here as well as parents does make a difference, makes a deep difference indeed. Anytime I get a chance to be with Brother Tavis Smiley, of course, I'm always quite delighted. It's been 25 years now. When I first met this brother, he was hardly just out of his teenage years, and we decided then that we were going to give our lives and be willing to die for the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and a Catholic sister named Dorothy Day and an Irish brother named Tom Hayden. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about people who have decided to be certain kind of human beings, who wrestle with line 38A of Plato's Apology. The unexamined life is not worth living. But each and every one of them would add the examined life is painful. And you all know here at Georgetown, this grand institution fundamentally dedicated to that Greek notion of paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A, deep education, not cheap schooling. And deep education has to do with what? Wrestling with what it means to be human. What it means to be a featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creature born between urine and feces. That's who we are. If it wasn't for the love push of our mamas, we wouldn't be here. Unless your mama opted for cesarean section. But this lecture series, and Brother Tavis talking about poverty, has to do with what kind of human being you will choose to be. What kind of community, what kind of neighborhood, what kind of nation, what kind of species do we really want to be? I tell my students each time they enter my classes, be it at Princeton or Yale, or I'm going to Union Theological Seminary, and I know you've got two magnificent professors here, my dear brother, Michael Eric Dyson. I may not always agree with that brother, but he's a genius. He's a Negro genius. There's no doubt about that. Patrick Deneen, another one of towering figures here. When you enter their classrooms, it's very much about learning how to die in order to learn how to live. Because when you muster the courage to critically examine assumptions that you have, they could be racist, they could be deeply imperialist in terms of thinking an American baby has more weight than a baby in Ethiopia or Guatemala or Switzerland or Tel Aviv and West Bank. It could be deeply sexist, it could be homophobic. Whatever gets in the way of keeping track of the humanity of other people. Deep prejudices need to die in order for us individually and for democracies to live. And that's about courage to think critically. One of the major challenges of young brothers and sisters of all colors, 18, 19, 20, 21, is that you often taught that the end aim of life is to be successful and to be the smartest in the room. How empty, how shallow, how hollow. In fact, it reminds me of that film, The Social Network. I don't know if anybody got a chance to see that for the network. New York Times said this movie is about the triumph of the human spirit. I said, I got to check it out. Oh, I got to check that out. Oh, yeah, I'm sitting on the front row, popcorn and all, you know. Triumph of the human spirit. And what do I see? Well, one of the heroes of the younger generation. Want to be smart, wealthy, powerful, big title, big position, insecure male ego, women as object of sexual conquest. B word on the card to show how smart and wealthy he is. I said nothing but a species of spiritual malnutrition. Emptiness of the soul, thinking you can possess your soul by means of possessing commodities. A form of moral constipation. Because he had a sense of what was right, but it was stuck and it wouldn't flow. The right and the good just stuck. Too much greed, too much avarice, too much envy, too much jealousy, too much immaturity, too much insecurity. Not really wrestling with the Socratic question of what it means to be human. Well, you see, I come out of a tradition, Brother Tavis Smiley comes out of a tradition that says we talk about poverty because we're concerned about unarmed truth, and condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. Everybody's suffering, no matter what color, no matter what class or gender or sexual orientation or civilization. And we also are fundamentally committed to unapologetic love. And love is a non-market value. All the money in the world will still leave you shallow and hollow if you don't learn to love wisdom, love justice, love neighbor. I'm a Christian. I love enemies. I'm working on it. I'm wrestling with it. But I say this for the younger generation especially because when we talk about reproducing and reinvigorating American democracy, we're talking about being courageous. But if your conception of being human is tied to just success, material prosperity, and being well-adjusted to injustice, just want to fit in and well-adapted to indifference to the suffering of others, just want everybody to see your individual achievement. Kind of peacock sensibility. Look at me, look how smart I am, look how much money I got, look at my trophy spouse. I'm not talking to anybody in this room, it's somewhere in this country. That kind of spiritual emptiness is running afoot. It goes hand in hand with the greed running amok. It goes hand in hand with the fact that we don't have a public discourse of the fact that 22% of our precious children live in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. That is a moral obscenity. I know our dear sister from Canada, much lower poverty rate. Single payer health care. Oh yes, oh yes. Conservative brothers and sisters in on that consensus. Why? Because they something like justice. Brother Martin used to say, what justice is what love looks like in public. That's what Martin King used to say. Because if you really love folk, you can't stand the fact of being treated unjustly. You loathe the fact of being treated unfairly. Then how could it be that for almost 45 years, we can't have a discourse on poor people? Why so? 1% of the population owns 42% of the wealth. Sounds oligarchic, plutocratic. To some degree, still pigmentocratic. It's colorful a bit, but more like the National Hockey League than the NBA. Legacy of white supremacy still alive. Black man in the White House, brilliant, charismatic black man, brilliant, charismatic black woman, wife, wonderful children, grandmother there. Absolutely, that is progress. Brother Malcolm X used to say, what, you don't stab folk in the back 9 inches, pull it out 3 inches, and then just celebrate your progress. Still got a new Jim Crow out there. Got prison industrial complex out there. Got trigger-happy policing out there. Got arbitrary judicial power deployed out there. Still got racial discrimination in the workplace out there, just like sexual discrimination in the workplace, and homophobic discrimination of the workplace out there. So many still stuck in the basement. And Brother Tavis Smiley and I simply said that past 25 years, and for the next, you probably got about 30 left. I got 12, but that's all right. That we're going to go down swinging, talking about non-market values like love of wisdom, love of justice, love of neighbor, love of enemy, engaging in critical reflection in order to leave the world just a little better than we found it. And I salute younger generation because the Occupy movement is very much a young people's movement. I'm old school. That's new school. I salute them. I'm blessed to be standing alongside them. Why? They look and see corporate greed and wealth inequality. How could it be the top 400 individuals in America have wealth equivalent to the bottom 150 million fellow citizens? What is going on? They're so smart. They deserve it. Sure. I was born at night, but not last night. I grew up with some brilliant, creative young brothers and sisters on the chocolate side of town. And many of them locked into the prison industrial complex. Many of them had to deal with arbitrary policing. Well, they had personal flaws. They made bad judgments. I said, oh, you're talking about some investment bankers? Investment bankers went under. They got welfare. Trillions of dollars. And free loans. Wouldn't it be nice if students get free loans? Wouldn't that be a beautiful thing? Oh, if we treated our students the way we treat our investment bankers. Unlimited. And then they still sit on it. And what happens? Warped priorities. No discourse about poverty. Money for jails and prisons and criminal justice system. Money for wars in Afghanistan, money for drones dropping bombs supposedly on terrorists, but so far we've killed about 850 innocent civilians. The secret war in Pakistan, in Yemen, and Somalia, no serious talk about it, no, not at all. Is it an accident that Brother Martin Luther King Jr., when he died, that 55% of black people disapproved of him? And 72% of Americans disapproved of him, yet everybody loves him in the grave. Everybody loves him now. No. That brother was telling the truth. It hurt. He was Socratic. He cut against the grain. He was maladjusted to injustice. He was what the great Arthur Miller, one of the grand American playwrights, called the Misfits. He was a misfit. We need more misfits in the younger generation. We need more maladjusted folk in the younger generations, ones that just don't want to just be comfortably fit in for your own convenience, but rather straighten your back up, take a stand, think for yourself, listen for yourself. I spend a lot of time in hip-hop studios with some of the grand artists of our day. I've been blessed to do that. But when I come in, I tell them up front, I'm old school. I'm Motown. I'm Philly Sound. I'm Stax. I'm Curtis Mayfield, Luther Vandross, Nina Simone. And one thing about each and every one of those folk I mentioned, that they were originals. Too many in the younger generation, copies. Just imitations. What's the markets presenting? What's the media putting forward? How can I become successful in the narrow sense? No, listen to Eddie Kendricks, even as a member of a group called the Temptations. Listen to the supernatural quality of his falsetto. That's him. He comes from a people that says, lift every voice. Too many young people lifting the echoes. Oh, we need more voices, not echoes at Georgetown. We need more originals, not copies at Georgetown. And to do it in such a way that you understand the definition of greatness, which is different than success. But he who she is greatest among you will be your servant. This is what our Jewish brothers and sisters gave to the world. The gift of prophetic discourse. A whole battalion of prophetic voices, Micah and Isaiah and Nahum and others. To be human is to spread loving kindness, hesed to the orphan, the widow, the fatherless, the motherless, the weak, the vulnerable that Brother Tavis was talking about. Now, it's not as if our Jewish brothers and sisters enact that in their practice, because they're human beings like us. They're cracked vessels like each and every one of us. But if you take it seriously, and our Muslim brothers and sisters flow from it, even our secular atheists and agnostic brothers and sisters recognize the uniqueness of each individual and personality that has a certain sanctity and dignity. And if you're serious about that, then you have to wrestle with poverty. It's not just a utilitarian calculation. It's in my self-interest to be concerned about folk catching hell because I want to be part of a society that doesn't collapse. Well, I can understand that utilitarian logic, but it's got to be deeper than that. It's got to have something to do with the fact that you have a hypersensitivity to the suffering of other people. And that is what made not just America, but every democratic experiment concerned about public interest and common good, not just private gain and philosophic calculation about pleasure. That's what's made it worthwhile. That's what's made it a joy to be human, not just a pleasure. The moral and spiritual dimension of what Brother Tavis Smiley is talking about. That's what flows through this text as well, and that's precisely why I find so much joy working with this brother. We went on 18-city tour in 7 days. That's a whole lot of movement. 2 black men in America, moving like that. Police didn't touch us. Now we got another 14-city tour with the text. Significant slices of the funds going to Feed America, keeping track of the children, concerned with the workers in the trade union movement, connected to the gay brothers and lesbian sisters who often spit on, and very much tied to our indigenous peoples. The only condition that I mentioned when Tavis called me and said, "Are you ready to go on a poverty tour?" I said, "Oh, I didn't have any plans to." I said, one precondition, let's start on the Indian reservation. Because our precious indigenous brothers and sisters don't have to be in the room for us to be hypersensitive about their suffering. They're human beings like us. So I thank you all so very much. We'll have a little time for questions.
That's great, man. All right. So there's a microphone to my right. There's a microphone to my left.
People could line up to both
As
mics,
many as
that'd
we
be
can. We
fantastic.
promise to cut our answers as short as we can. On the right, let's hit it. Go. Question, comment.
My name is My name is Brian Perry. I am a Florida A&M graduate, Georgetown medical student, and a misfit of the younger generation. I think you two have done a great job of highlighting being the voice of the poor and highlighting the rift between the haves and the have-nots. My question comes from a hypothetical situation. Let's say that we take America and we take all the money and the wealth in America and distribute it evenly amongst all the people and individuals in America. The first question is, do you think that over time the rift will reform? The second question is, how long, if so, how long do you think that rift reform? And finally, what do you think would be contributing factors to why that rift would possibly reform?
You want to take a stab at that, brother? No, that's an interesting thought experiment, though, brother. Definitely. Now, of course, as a revolutionary Christian and deep Democrat, I'm also a libertarian, you see, so I don't want to just take people's money. I want there to be some rule of law, rights and liberties, democratic process by which people can agree that it's in the public interest that there not be a whole huge slice of poor people in the society. Because in the end, it's just like in terms of you have to decide what kind of person you're going to be. You decide to be a gangster, then be a gangster. Hey, be honest with yourself. It's true. And I ask America the same question. If America wants to be oligarchic and plutocratic and pigmentocratic, just say you are and don't say you're a democracy. Just be honest. Be candid. And as a Democrat, I got to leave that also in the hands of the decision of others, you see. So I can only raise my voice as Democrat and say, this is what I really think is best, and I come from a tradition, which is multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious, of folk who believe the same thing, and I reached the conclusion that that prophetic tradition is the leaven in the American democratic loaf. Because without those folk, America would have been authoritarian a long time ago. Can you imagine America without Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth? Could be still slaveocratic. Confederacy could have won. Tavis and I wouldn't be here, you wouldn't either. So that's the beginning of an answer to the question in terms of how do you try to keep alive the best. The thought experiment in terms of, well, would inequality come back? Oh, sure, there's always going to be forms of inequality, though, brother. Definitely. The only way you could ensure that everybody has something equal all the time is have a dictator. I love people. I hate dictatorships. So I wouldn't allow for that. See? It's got to be a democratic process.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Dr. West, I'd first like to tell you what a thrill it is for me to hear from you. I've been following you for a while. Also, you mentioned Patrick Deneen. I just want to mention him to everybody. He's just an incredible guy in our community here.
My dear brother, you tell him I said hello. Send my love and respect.
I'll do absolutely that. And my question actually comes from a class with him. It's been well argued that the reason why there's so much greed today it's systemic in our meritocracy, that everybody's got such an unfixed status that they have to just continue earning and earning and earning. And that in our old aristocracy, where you had to come from the Mayflower to go to Princeton, you had more of a sense of honor or duty to others, and that we're much less grateful now. If our greed is so systemic, then how do we convince all of our meritocrats, everyone in this room, everyone in your Princeton classes, to give that up and to love the least of ours?
That's part of that learning how to die that I was talking about. Absolutely. I mean, you remember, Plato's argument against democracy is what? It will be a society characterized by mass ignorance and unruly passion. It will be hedonistic, narcissistic. The citizens will not want to be citizens. They'll want to be self-medicated, addicted. You say, dang, Plato writing in 2012? No, that's thousands of years ago. Plato's profound, but I'm not persuaded by him. He's one of the great critics of democracy. He didn't think it would ever be able to sustain itself. Every day, Democrats get up wrestling with Plato's challenge because we see narcissistic, self-medicated, highly individualistic consumers not acting oftentimes as citizens, and a lot of ignorance, sometimes learned ignorance. Professors like myself, all of us have our forms of ignorance, you see. And at the same time, we also see democracies responding to Plato's critique and saying, We can curtail our ignorance with high-quality education, public education especially. Somehow we can curtail our passions because there's something called public interest, serving in a variety of different ways. But as you know, it's a balance of forces that's always quite fragile, though, brother.
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for your time. I'm Casey. I'm a government major and African studies minor. And I just wanted to ask you a question about what's the structure for when the new poor stop being poor and go back to being the middle class? You know, we've been asking this question since 1967. Where do we go from here? Well, you know, what happens once the unity basically breaks down and, you know, those that are poor regain their status, they regain their, you know, jobs because the economy, you know, goes back to being the way it was before? What's built into your plan to make sure that, you know, those of us who have been poor for a long time have a way to, you know, actually make their way up the ladder? What do you want us to do?
It's a powerful question. Let me give you 2 quick answers. One, that's a big if. When you say, you know, if and when that happens. The last chapter in this book starts with a powerful story that we share of a conversation between Barack Obama after he was elected. So he's President Obama now. He's talking to the late Steve Jobs at a private event in the Silicon Valley where we were yesterday. Yesterday we were live on Google, on YouTube, talking about this book. We kicked off our tour at Google headquarters yesterday. So Obama is in the Silicon Valley. He's talking to Jobs, and he's talking to Mr. Jobs about this idea he has to roll out this program called insourcing. He wants to insource jobs. You recall in his State of the Union address this year, he spent a lot of time talking about insourcing, so he did get around to putting that idea out. But he talks to Steve Jobs, and Jobs tells him that the jobs that have been outsourced ain't coming back. Obama is stunned. He's speechless because he's talking to Jobs. He's looking for some encouragement for his insourcing idea, and Jobs is telling him those jobs are gone. They're not coming back. So it's a big if, number one, that those jobs are going to come back that so many Americans have lost. Secondly, we argue in the book that it's hard to imagine what the motivating factor is for any corporate CEO now to really be concerned with putting Americans back to work. Because of all this corporate austerity, if you will, because of all this downsizing, they now know they can compete with fewer employees. They know they can make more money at home by sending more American jobs abroad. The only reason why any corporate CEO has any rationale whatsoever for bringing on more people, the only way he or she can justify that to their board and to their shareholders is if there's such a demand for their product that you have to hire more people. If the demand for your product isn't that great, that's the only condition under which you hire more people. So we're skeptical in the book about whether or not there's even a motivation for corporate America to start to hire persons a second time around. And so I guess I get your question, and I'm still wrestling with it. But fundamentally, I don't know that in the text we even allow ourselves to consider whether or not it's going to be the way it once was. What we do call for, finally, is for some fundamental fairness. What this country lacks is fundamental fairness. As I suggested earlier tonight, it's by giving people an opportunity to exercise their God-given talents, giving them an opportunity at self-determination. And the game is so rigged against poor people. What we talk about in the book is the criminalization and the demonization of poor people, and how our policies in Washington now punish and they're pejorative toward poor people. And that's what's wrong. We argue in the book that there's a bipartisan consensus in this town against the poor. So the left and the right aren't serious about making poverty a priority. So I take your question, but I'm going to think more about the premise because I'm not so sure that, again, that jobs is wrong, that those jobs, you know, are gone, not coming back. And I'm still trying to find the reason to believe, since they're so greedy, I'm trying to find the reason to believe that American corporations have any reason to bring back those jobs that they gave away and sent around the world. Hope that makes some sense to you, though.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Robert Byrne. I'm a senior sociology major. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here. This has been a great opportunity. And quick plug, if I may, for those of you who would like to be voices instead of echoes, Georgetown Occupy is having a GA immediately following this event at 9:30 in Hoya Court. We'd love to see you there. My question is, what role does student activism play in eradicating poverty today? And what can Georgetown students, what strategies can we take to specifically, can we employ to be part of the greater struggle? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, though, and I salute the Occupy activity at Georgetown, absolutely.
Thank you.
one, I think it's very important to note that young people have always played a disproportionate role in democratic awakenings, democratic enlightenments, and fundamental changes in the name of genuine democracy. And Occupy movement is one expression of that. We saw it in the 60s with SNCC, we saw it at SDS, we saw it with the coming of the awakening around American apartheid and Jim Crow and so forth. I think on the one hand, it's a matter of students coming to terms with their own situation and thinking critically, why do I have these loans? Why is student loan now more than credit card loan in America? You see? So you got to tell a story about that. Critical reflection, right? In the same way we're talking about the economy in Paul Krugman's new book, In This Depression Now, analysis of the economy, analysis of student debt, and so forth and so on. Then organize and mobilize. Not just based on that, but connecting it with the social misery of others in the prison, the precious children in any community, working people catching hell, and so forth and so on. You got tremendous energy, you got tremendous creativity, and old brothers like me, I learn and listen. I learn, and I'm there to give some advice too, because I've been around for a while, but I learn and listen. So each generation has to meet the challenge of trying to reinvigorate a democracy, or you will lose it. You see, this talk about American exceptionalism, Americans on automatic in terms of progress, that's a lie. There's something called regress. There's something called retreat. American can go authoritarian in a second. Look at this National Defense Authorization Act. I'm a plaintiff against it. It's authoritarian, even with Ron Paul. I'm with that brother on that issue. About the only issue I'm with, but I'm with him on that. Because he's libertarian. Rights and liberties, precious. Executive power, expanding. Executive power deciding who can live or die in terms of assassination and murder if you're against the interests of the country. No rule of law, no due process, no judicial process. Authoritarian. Young folk raising their voices to hit that head on.
Thank you, gentlemen. To be briefly boring, book recommendation. Tony Judt wrote a book called Ill Fares the Land. If you haven't read it already, if anyone's interested in these issues, it's a great articulation of our argument. But you gentlemen present an argument that everyone in this auditorium finds very convincing. I've been to Georgetown for 4 years now, and I recognize many of the faces in the room. But I also recognize many of the faces that aren't in the rooms. The college Democrats are here. The Occupy movement is here. Where are the college Republicans? Where are the young, intelligent people of my generation who disagree with your premises? I believe that there are lots of people here who agree with what you have to say, but I also would bet that throughout your entire campaign, you've been talking to people who already agree with you. And although you two gentlemen are very talented at motivating us, how do we talk to the other side of the aisle? There are lots of people in this room who are going to be knocking on doors this summer and this fall for this election, and not everyone who opens that door is going to be a Democrat. So what do we say to the Republicans when they disagree with us?
We had a half-hour dialogue with Brother Sean Hannity today. Now, that's not the most rational situation, but that's in part what we're talking about. But you're right, we got to reach out. But I mean, it's not that you have to go far. I mean, we can go members of our own family. You know, families aren't ideologically homogeneous. Thanksgiving dinner is fascinating. You got different perspectives right around the table, you know what I mean? So you're right. I mean, how do you enter the public square in a highly polarized society, bastardized society, where people don't want to take a risk to even engage in public dialogue because so much name calling and finger pointing? What I love about Brother Tavis Smiley, you all watch his show, right? You stay up late enough to watch his show? And you see the variety of voices that he has coming back and forth? You see, this is not just talking to people who he agrees with. It's cowardly just to spend time with folk who agrees with you. You're scared. You're intimidated. Take a risk. Be courageous. Stretch out. Argue with others in this regard. And learn from others. We can learn from a variety of our different right-wing brothers in terms of their concerns about government being corrupt. They're right about that. The Tea Party's right about the corruption of the American government. They're wrong about the fact that the oligarchs who provide them still run free. You see, we learn from an anarchist. State power can be authoritarian. We learn from communists. Oligarchs, plutocrats, monopolies can be authoritarian. We learn from a variety of these things. That's, I think, part of the Socratic energy that I'm talking about unleashing. It's not just an ideological energy. It's a Socratic energy. It cuts across the board.
the one argument that if I could add right quick, the one argument that at least will get them to listen, I have discovered in these conversations with people like Sean and others, is back to the point that Doc made earlier. When you start out by suggesting that this is the moral and spiritual issue of our time, so often those on the right who happen to be part of the religious right, at least you're connecting to something now. That moral argument, that spiritual argument, they will give listen to that, number one. Number two, in the book, in the last part of the book, the Poverty Manifesto, these 12 things that we suggest need to be done. One of the 12, we don't have time to go through all of them, but one of the 12 is a White House conference. Just like Barack Obama, as his first act, signed the Lilly Ledbetter law for women in the workplace, which he should have done. We're suggesting that, calling for the next president of the United States to make as his first official executive order the calling of a White House conference on the eradication of poverty in America. So you bring to the table all the experts, the disparate voices about poverty, so that we can fashion a national plan, a bipartisan national plan for how we are over 10, 15, 25 years going to reduce poverty significantly in this country. So that if all these voices can be heard in a conversation about an issue that we care about, nobody in this country wants to be poor. And we've got to be concerned about this growing gap. Remember the article in the New York Times, the corporate CEO on Wall Street who called the New York Times writer to ask how serious the Occupy thing was going to be. He was concerned about his personal safety. Yeah. These suckers are at the very least concerned about their own personal safety. They know that when things get this bad, they got to look over their own shoulders. So that nobody wants to be poor. We understand that this imbalance is too much. When you put together a national conference on the eradication of poverty, and you bring those voices together, then maybe we can get some traction on that. We just talked yesterday about Chile. Between 1987 and 2009, the country of Chile had a national plan to reduce poverty. They went from 48% to 11%. And there are other countries around the world who have done this. So this is not a will problem. I mean, it's not a skill problem for us. It's a will problem.
And we went from nearly 25 to 11.
After Johnson.
During the Johnson years. And especially among the precious elderly. We went from almost 38 to 6. That's very important. It can be done. Now, in terms of vows of poverty, we got a Catholic tradition of monks and nuns who make vows of poverty.
I have not taken that vow.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah, I haven't
but we want to acknowledge that there is a certain spiritual quality for folk who make that choice. But most of us don't want to make that choice. You don't choose to be poor in that sense. But we want to keep that exception in place.
I'm getting the sign here, but let's try to squeeze in a few more questions if we can. I know they're calling me. Yes, sir.
How you doing? My name is Robert Jackson. I'm a sophomore here at Georgetown. You touched on the issue of the prison industrial complex. Most of the people that are in prison, they don't have a voice. They're part of that 99%. They're forgotten, and even when they're released, it's hard for them to find work, or even, some aren't even allowed to vote at all. How do you get their needs and what they need heard to the public, or part of the talk, because those people are also often demonized because they have a criminal record? So how do you approach that issue?
So very right, though, brother. Michelle Alexander's new book, The New Jim Crow, number 8 now, New York Times bestseller list. Very important, raising consciousness. Many people have been doing this. Kant and Angela Davis and others, trying to get us to acknowledge our destiny is inextricably intertwined with those in prison. We know a war on drugs was primarily a chocolate affair. It was police targeting of poor black and brown communities. Black, white, young people, both 13% flying high in the friendly skies. 62% convictions, black and brown. That's a racist criminal justice system. Differential treatment. And then, of course, cocaine, soft cocaine and crack, crack versus cocaine was another way in which that kind of differential treatment was at work. So you ended up with a prison industrial complex that's 60% black and brown, all not disproportionately poor. The quickest growing are poor white brothers and sisters, though. So this class becomes very, very important here.
Let me do this because they're yanking us. We want to sign as many books as we can before we go live on CNN. For those persons who are standing right now, your question or comment, I know we can't respond to all of it, but I want to make sure we hear it. This conversation for us continues every day on our Twitter and on our Facebook. If you go to therichandtherestofus.com, the website by the name of the book, therichandtherestofus.com, we're continuing this conversation, following it, answering questions online. So we're very much engaged, even beyond these various gatherings where we can't spend all night, although we would love to engage you all night. So whatever your question or comment is, we want to hear it. For the record, this is being recorded, so we can at least hear it. If we know we don't have time to respond to all of it, why don't you let us hear what's on your mind, and that way everybody in line will not have been standing in vain. All right, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Molly. I'm a graduate student in public policy, and it seems to me that a big contributor to the issue of poverty is the socioeconomic achievement gap in education. And the journalist Alex Kotlowitz writes about poor children are growing up to be poor adults because we're not giving them the opportunity to learn. So this might be a lofty question, but what do we do about that? How do we address education and poverty? Because I know that there's an interaction between the two, but it's a huge problem.
It's a great question. There's a whole chapter in the book about that. I'm glad you raised that.
We can learn something from Finland. We can
Exactly.
learn something from Finland.
We'll come back to that. We thank you for your question. Brilliant question, because you're right. The link between education and poverty is well documented. Yes, sir.
How you doing? Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Harry Bethke, School of Foreign Service, master's student. My question was, has the time come to perhaps start treating the bifurcation of income in the United States as a national security issue? It's damaging our credibility overseas and damaging our sort of ability to present ourselves as the best in a realm of ideas. And if so, what would be a way to reach out to the national security community, who's largely agnostic on the issue of poverty in America?
Powerful question.
Wonderful question, but
Wonderful
when
question.
the American Gibbon puts pen to paper and writes the masterpiece, the decline and fall of the American empire is going to be because of internal rot as opposed to external threat. We'll implode from within. So that becomes national security, and you're absolutely right about it. But we do have a chapter on that.
It's a great question. Yes, sir.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for bringing this epic team up to our campus. I listen to your radio show every week. I'll be listening to your answer for my question.
Okay.
My name is Manny Manriquez, by the way. I'm also a School of Foreign Service master's candidate. So you speak about having discussions with people with whom we disagree about the major issues of the day. And while this is very important, I find that when it comes time to cast that vote, to make that decision, what should be done, who should we vote for, and those in Congress, when it comes time for them to cast that vote, although they've had a very fruitful debate, they still cast the same vote.
Right.
So my question is, how do we move beyond having an open discourse to making some progress and actually getting people to make the right choices?
Powerful question.
Thank you
for it. Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Aya Wallerberry. I'm a sophomore here at Georgetown, and I'm from Detroit, Michigan, so I know firsthand about poverty, growing up in a family with income less than 20 grand. Like, it's serious. And I just feel like the discourse about poverty, especially recently, always talks about the middle class that was instead of the people who've always been poor or in poverty that currently are and have been for decades. And
That's right.
how do we incorporate more of the poverty that is than the middle class that was in more of our discourse?
We discussed that
Oh,
head
that's
on in the
very
book, and one of the points powerful, yeah. One of the points we make is that the reason why poverty is getting some traction right now as a conversation is because it is no longer color-coded, as we suggested earlier. Now that there's so many other Americans who are experiencing this, now it's a conversation we want to have. But we have forgotten and have ignored all these other years the persons who have been perennially or persistently poor. So it's a powerful question that we take on in the book. We thank you for that. We went to Detroit on our poverty tours. We saw that. Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Katerina Downward. I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service, and I'm from Athens, Greece. I really thank you for speaking about the threat to democracy in the U.S. today, and it appears to me that that there is a marked criminalization of dissent in the U.S. today, but disappointingly so at a university like Georgetown, which I would expect to be more engaged in sort of forms of dissent. And a lot of talk of recent at this university about civility seems to exclude protest and civil disobedience from the domain of civility. And there has been a lot of well-adjustment to inequality and to injustice that you spoke about. And this, of course, happens to the detriment of democracy and sort of moving forward to kind of reinvigorating democracy. So I was wondering, whether you could speak to the criminalization of dissent in the United States and also the trade-off between liberalism and democracy that very often happens, and then to sort of offer some advice about how to go forward with this question and these considerations in mind at our university.
Thank you.
Powerful question.
Yeah.
Powerful question.
As you can imagine, Greece is mentioned in this text.
Yeah, no, the courageous struggle
Yeah.
of the Greek people.
Absolutely.
Bankers in control and no control over the national currency and the cutbacks, austerity in the midst of depression, reinforcing deeper depression, even as the bankers are able to be treated more friendly, very much like what happened in the States in 2008 to 2011, both Republican Party and Democratic Party in this regard, you see. So that, but this criminalization of dissent is very real. We saw it in the United States under McCarthyism in the 50s. And it's only when you have examples, you see, because people are scared. And when they see fear looked in the face and overcome, they're encouraged. You see? So you have to have examples, more and more examples of fighting the criminalization, the Patriotic Act, National Defense Authorization Act, over and over. But first you have to know what's going on, but also when you have a sense of what's going on, you got to fight it.
Courage is contagious.
Courage can be contagious, but it can be scary too.
It's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Last comment. Question, comment. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Patricia LaFontaine. My question is real quick. My question is, can America and is America prepared to handle the poor being empowered?
The poor being empowered.
The poor being empowered. The poor voting on the street still, but still show up at election day. Can America handle, is America prepared to handle the poor being empowered?
I'd love to find out.
This Georgetown something else, though, bro.
I know,
This
man.
Georgetown
It's
something else.
Yeah.
These deep
Oh,
questions. Deep questions.
I'm not a student.
You can imagine in 1920 they say, well,
Sorry.
can we handle women voting?
Exactly.
My God, this is the end of
But I
Western
just wonder what it would
civilization
look
of the
like.
women vote.
I
Can
wonder
we-
what it would look like. I
can
saw
we
it was
send
free,
black
so I showed up.
But it's
I'm
a profound.
FAMU graduate.
But I say this.
Thank
though,
you. Thank you
that
very much.
if America can't handle treating poor people with decency, which goes far beyond just voting, then you don't have a democracy. That's what it means. And just say who you are. Don't lie about yourself.
Well, let's show them who they are.
That's exactly right. But at the same time, you see a tradition to produce us, like Brother Martin, Sister Fanny, Curtis Mayfield. Keep on pushing, right? Because we do believe that the potential is there for America to learn how to die in order to be more democratic, more free, more inclusive, but it's an open question.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. I know we've got to.
Thank you very much. Don't move, don't move, don't move, don't move. Sean.
Thank you everyone so much for coming. Can we give them another round of applause, please? Thank you. We'd like, we're asking that everyone please remain seated while Dr. West and Mr. Smiley move up to the book signing area, and then afterward we'll have everyone queue up for the book signing. Thank you everyone for coming.